the question here is whether the fight towards equality is on hold. And we know, the thinking is that AI really is the great hope here. In speaking with you previously, you mentioned this fascinating study that SmartRecruiters has done. Maybe you could talk a little bit about the study and the findings.
Sure. Well, we've done many, but I think the one that you're referencing is one that we did actually when we launched our AI product. And so for those that don't know, SmartRecruiters is essentially a talent acquisition suite. So we support recruiters in tracking applicants throughout the journey. And we launched a product about 2 or 3 years ago, I'd say, at this point, that was intended to help reduce bias in the screening workflow by servicing candidates that were coming through the job application or CRM workflows and scoring them based on skills, experience, and what we believe to be classifiers that wouldn't create bias. So time away from work is a great example of that. Should you be a woman that has a child, or your physical location? We also conceal the names and contact information of people until they get to a specific piece in the process, so that you're actually fundamentally screening people for what they have done and do, and not for who they are. And when we launched the product, we actually had the entire conference. Our conference had to participate in a bit of the science experiment, which they screened through a number of different candidate resumes. Many of them were actually identical CVs. They didn't know that, though, because there were about 100 or so. And they were able to pick their top 10. One group was able to see names and contact information, the other not. And as it turns out, in the group that was able to see names and contact information, the top 10 were predominantly people very much like the screeners themselves. And in the bottom, they had people with the same CVs that were actually of different ethnicities. And in particular, there was one group that had a Middle Eastern man and just a white man, same CV, same experience. And in the group that could see names, the Middle Eastern man was at the very bottom of the list. In the group that was that couldn't see the names, he was at the very top. Hi. So some interesting things happening there.
Yeah. So Susan, can I comment on that? So there's a name for what you did. I'm sure you know this. It's an audit study.
Yep.
Audit studies have been done for decades.
Yep.
There is very good and very depressing meta-analysis that was done of audit studies by Harvard a few years ago. And basically the findings are exactly the same. And basically what they found was that discrimination, this was looking at race in the US, and they basically found that for exact same resume, for every 10 interviews, a white person got, a black person got 7, and a Latino person got 8 with the identical information. So, I mean, kudos to you guys. It's amazing that you did basically a real-time audit study, because, again, I think it just goes to show how human bias, this is my big thing as a cognitive neuroscientist, human bias is far more scalable than any kind of AI bias. And yet that's not the narrative that's out there, unfortunately. So.
Right. I mean, I guess the human bias is a real element here, but there's also a problem with the underlying data set, right? In terms of whether the set itself is biased. Nicole, I know we had spoken about that underlying bias in the data set.
Yes, and I'm really happy, Frida and Rebecca, for outlining sort of the human bias. And we face this challenge, for example, right? Sometimes when we actually know a data set will not be, like, for example, if we work for dermahistopathology, basically skin grafts, right? And we do this for a German lab, we know that the data set will not be balanced. If you look at the world population and the diversity in the world population, it will not be diversified. Still, right, it's not illegitimate to build a product based on this data set, but you have to be aware of these limitations, right? And you have to be aware that it might not work as well on certain ethnicities or age groups or, whatever you're looking at. And you have to be aware of that in the workflow, so as not to put at a disadvantage anybody who would benefit or not benefit from this diagnosis. But, it's the same in the human process, right? The actual dermahistopathologist who would look at this skin graft underneath the microscope would also not have this information typically. They would just be looking at a blob of, what looks like Wiener Schnitzel underneath a microscope, right? And so you have to be aware of it, that's for sure.
Right.
But can I just, sorry.
Yeah, go for it. Go. Yeah.
It's like what I write about all the time. So there are two things. I mean, what Rebecca brought home, there's no underlying bias in that data. It's the exact same data that you're looking at, and that's purely human bias. That is saying, oh, Jamal should be less likely to be interviewed than John with the exact same data, right? So that's just human bias, nothing to do with underlying differences in the data. And then what Nicole just said is absolutely true as well. There are historical, differences in what we call base rates of data, right? Very true on resumes, for example, everything from engineering degrees to executive leadership positions to a whole host of things have unequal base rates by gender and by race, right? And so I completely agree with Nicole that it's unavoidable in certain instances, right? I mean, if you have actually proven that an engineering degree is needed for something, okay, fine. So then that is going to bias your data. But one thing I would say in HR, and I think that Rebecca, your data speaks to this to some extent, is there are two things. A lot of times we think we need something and it's very unclear that that's actually true. I mean, is it needed that we have to have 3 years of experience as opposed to 2, right? And people just put in these sort of willy-nilly requirements that, then cause data problems, bias problems that we haven't verified that it's necessary. So that's one thing I would say. And then the second thing is, people are using data sets in hiring like facial analysis, which is well known to have massive problems from a racial perspective when there's no need. I mean, there's just absolutely no need to be out there using facial analysis. And we've been pretty outspoken about this, as have other platforms, saying, look, there's plenty of other data you can be looking at. And that's actually one of the things we do at pymetrics is we don't look at resumes. We look at soft skill data, which doesn't have these underlying differences by race and by gender. So you should absolutely be looking at data that is as unbiased as you can get. And you definitely shouldn't be looking at data that, like facial analysis, which is not proven to be job related and also is introducing biases. So to Nicole's point, in dermohistopathology, certain biases are going to be unavoidable, right? And maybe engineering degrees are necessary for certain things. You can't avoid that. But I think there are many places, especially in HR, where we're adding to those historical biases or other types of biases like facial analysis data that's just, really spurious in my opinion. So,
but if you have a data,
I'm very passionate about this, as you can see.
Yeah, no, of course, which is wonderful. I mean, and I'm thinking, Germany or Austria or places like that where the data set, for instance, it looks at, say, white men being successful, right? Nicole, you had brought this up before, and then that's the underlying data set of what constitutes success. So how do you fight against that? Loubna, I know we had talked about this as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we see bias ramping up, as been said by my co-panelists, both in the physical and the digital world. And because AI systems learn from the past, it mimics the way we learn and it makes the same biases. So from an AI perspective and the algorithm perspective, how can we deal with that? I mean, the good thing to me is that with artificial intelligence and with algorithms, it's like a mirror. It shows us our own biases and we can measure it and we can balance it. So there are different ways from an algorithm perspective that we can do. Like Rebecca mentioned, let's not let the algorithm see the labels that can make the algorithm discriminative, such as the gender, such as the ethnicities, even the age. So some of the variables, we can take them from the training data and we train the algorithm with the features that represent the skills, they represent the performance, and help us in this way to almost blindside the algorithm. Don't tell them what is that. So that's one way. Another way is where we basically need some of these parameters. For example, in healthcare, we cannot, some of the covariates are very important to what diagnosis needs to take place. The gender, for example, is one of those other parameters as well. So if we can't hide, other ways to deal with, and it's not always possible, by the way, is to create balanced classes. So we have, for example, in the skin color, we train the algorithm with the same samples across different patches that we make sure that the algorithm is balanced. I do agree with Frida that bias is part of our lives. So this is the way we quickly quickly infer decisions. It helps us to make a decision quickly, and algorithms in that way, there are some biases that we can't help. They are not because of, they are coming from the way we interact. And I can give example from a work that we're doing at Okra at the moment. The peak of COVID created a lot of system biases. For example, many patients with other diseases are discriminated because of the high peak, even if that their cases are dangerous. So we are using AI to identify this bias and predict how many patients are in the backlog that are undertreated and untreated because everyone is in a tunnel vision looking only to COVID patients. So I must say it's a very, very big problem. Yeah,
I appreciate that. In fact, I want to get back to COVID. I think that's so top of mind for everyone. Frida, when I was speaking with you, you had as a neuroscientist, you had a really interesting way of looking at how to address bias, and it was more of a systems thinking kind of approach.
Yeah. So I mean, we just spoke about it. Basically, there are two systems in the human brain. There's sort of a fast unconscious system, right, which leads to unconscious bias, and then there's a more thoughtful, deliberative system. Daniel Kahneman called them system 1 and 2 thinking. We can get rid of the labels and just say there's this fast one and there's slow one, right? And I think for a long, long time, we have been trying with zero success to remove bias from the unconscious system. And at this point, we have 10 years worth of data showing it's a futile effort. It's a fool's errand. Unfortunately, unconscious bias training programs, while they're feel goods, and you can continue to do them to educate people, but they are not going to remove your unconscious bias. Like, point blank, that's just not going to happen. We have all the data are in. So what we should do instead is really harness the power of our deliberate conscious system to make system changes in how we hire people, right? All the things we've been talking about, whether it's blinding resumes, which is super important, right? Whether it's using AI to reduce bias in the system, whether it's chunking information so that what you think about Frida doesn't go through all of the responses that Frida does, but rather looking at Frida's responses and then other people's responses in one go, so that halo effect that you might have about certain candidates doesn't persist. So it's basically changing systems using our deliberate thinking system that's going to make the difference. And I think people sort of are coming around to this now. And again, there are a number of different things that are powerful. Technology is one of them. Changing processes is very powerful, as Rebecca mentioned, in terms of blinding. Other things are, transparency in your process, accountability of who's accountable for making these changes, metrics. And so I think the main point is just let's stop trying to change unconscious bias, because it's just a thing. We're unfortunately not going to get rid of it unless instead deliberately design systems with our deliberate thinking process that will mitigate bias and sort of counteract that fast unconscious bias system.
That's super interesting. In fact, in terms of counteracting the systemic bias, Rebecca, you had mentioned something super interesting about bar raisers, which I'd never heard that term before.
Yeah.
What's that about?
That's a process change that we've actually seen within some of our clients. I'll address that, but I also wanted to make a comment on what Frida was saying, because as somebody that sells AI technology and did this study, the fundamental reason why we did it was because there is this natural inclination of the buyer, the organization, to lean back on the control that they have and maybe their own unconscious bias. They ask us all the time, can I edit the algorithm? Can I somehow control the weighting? You have to sort of step back and say, well, no, because that's actually completely going against everything that we just decided. But they can't really understand why, because in their mind, the weight that they're providing to it is a requirement, but they actually don't know it to be a requirement. They just think it to be a requirement based on their historical behavior. And so we've had to use a lot of this to actually train them as to why we're making the choice we are, which is our customers have no control. I think that the process that you're referencing, though, is an interesting one, because when we roll out these products, you can't just solve everything with technology. There inevitably needs to be something within your business that fundamentally shifts. And what some of them have done is they've implemented these processes within their interview and hiring process, where somebody externally within their business, so like if I'm hiring an engineer, I actually have someone from my marketing team come in and evaluate the top 3 to 5 candidates side by side, and as an external individual looking at notes, reviews, resume data, then says, I think this would actually be the best candidate. And they compare that to where people landed, and they look at trend data on how consistently their bar raisers actually pick or do not, based on certain soft and hard facts and skills, the candidate that they end up creating the offer.
Right. So that's actually one of the processes that Frida was kind of referencing as external. But I want to turn to Nicole and ask you about whether you think more women in AI would help with, or women, and I should also say people who, BIPOC folks, folks who aren't traditionally represented in AI as, the ones creating and working on AI, whether you think that might help the system.
Yes, brief answer, absolutely. I think diversity is always, we see this as a driver of excellence, not only in AI, but in many other systems, politics, other industries. So very clear, yes. And I think what we shouldn't discard, however, right, it's also quite complex to manage diversity, right? It's also like you can have the best outcomes with diverse teams, but it's also kind of hard to manage teams that are, why do people like recruiting people that are like themselves? Because it's easier to understand where to push buttons and make them do stuff, right? I mean, so you also have to, I think, give people tools to actually manage diverse teams and, enable the different strengths in a team, because it's not just about having a nice group picture. It's really about hearing people. Yeah, that looks nice in the annual report, right? Oh, we all look like the United States, right? Yay. But but it's about really hearing people and giving them a voice. And I feel very strongly about that in technology. Absolutely, we need to do this for, first of all, it's a tool. So we want to also make sure we use it for the right issues. Female founders have other priorities when they start businesses, right? They're on average more interested, when you look at the Female Founders Monitor, they're on average more interested in social entrepreneurship, green tech, right? Other things. And that, let's put that tool to use for a diverse set of things. I was telling you about one of the founders, right, talking about fertility, like applications in the fertility industry. And one guy was like, oh, I really think that's a marginalized market. And I was like, really? You want to talk about prostates again? Are you kidding me? Like, this is a marginalized market. It's a double-digit growing market worldwide. So, so
let me just get back to the idea. By the way, I have a funny note or awful note. You talked about the brochures. I was just reading how AI was creating faces, like merging all the different kinds of faces to have fake people on your marketing campaigns to show how diverse you are, which kind of blows my mind. But I want to get back to having more women engaged in AI. And Loubna, you had you sort of framed it really nicely in terms of the importance of having more women in the field of AI.
Absolutely. So having more women helps on different levels. I mean, if we look to the digital bias, it's coming from two things. If we if the IT system is rule-based, so not probabilistic-based, then who made the rules? The person made the rules, and the system will be biased to that. So having the more women there, so we will handle the gender bias quite nicely. So when the system is probabilistic, which doesn't learn from rules, it learns from past occurrences, then we need to balance the data, but actually also bringing the human element to the AI system, where women have a different view on how the user interface, the interaction, how the system interacts. It makes it more human and more representative for the data. And this links to also what Nicole mentioned around, being in that stagnant belief that it should always happen in this way. How can we get an AI system from that stagnancy, from that looking into only one class of the problem, which is mostly biased? I think that one way that I really, really like, and we can learn from that as human beings, so we can learn from machines as well, is a process what we call regularization. So basically, instead of going and tuning the algorithm to not be biased, to not overtrain, what you do is you give a set of examples that are slightly different than each other and make the algorithm more smart in detecting those. One picture that we used a lot in image processing back in university was the Lena image. It's used to train, to detect the patterns, very, very beautiful image. And what we did was slightly add noise. We add white noise, we crop it, we segment it, and why we do that? So we create a noise at the input to make the algorithm basically adapt to that. And that's much, much better way than go in and just giving one Lena image and then tune the algorithm afterwards. Well, how can we learn from that? What we can learn as human beings is that instead of telling people you should be more kind of open, you should not make bias, and we can give them examples, not in a controlled setting, but in the free living environment of different scenes, like Groundhog Day, every day same.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. Yeah, it's super interesting. I do want to though close. I'm curious, like from the group, what if there are women out there who are thinking about coming into AI, like what kind of tips, because I know a lot of women may read, and Nicole, we talked about this, they may read sort of ads for jobs, but may think it's not for them. So just curious, Frida, Nicole, Rebecca, what's your sense? Frida.
I mean, I can speak to that. I mean, I'm not an engineer by training. I'm a lowly neuroscientist, as I always say. And I think, you know, other behavioral science fields and life science fields can often be a good training ground for working in AI. Being in AI doesn't mean that you necessarily have to be the one writing the code. There are, you know, you have to fundamentally understand the questions that you want to have asked and answered. That's a critical component of AI. And there's just a lot of product related stuff that happens in algorithm development. That doesn't mean you have to be the expert in, you know, some machine learning technique. You should understand it. It doesn't mean you have to be that person. So what I would say is I would encourage women of all walks of life to really consider it as a field. I know that might sound crazy to some people, but I think there's a lot more opportunity.
Absolutely.
I would add to that, absolutely. So I'm an economist and econometrician by training, so also not a programmer. I think also that women often tend to have the tendency, right, to pick out that one thing that they don't know in a job ad. Like, you will just not know, accept it. In machine learning is a fast moving field. You will not know tomorrow, you know, what is going on. Accept it, embrace it. And the good news is the guys also don't know. So, you know, you're at no disadvantage. Just have the courage and do this. It's a fast paced field. And, you know,
there's a great expression.
All of us here are probably hiring, and we're definitely
exactly
just for all black men.
So that's exactly. And in fact, there's an expression: "What would a straight white guy do?" And he would apply to probably all your people. Who here is hiring? Are you, Nicole? Oh, I think all of our panelists are hiring. So anybody who is interested in applying to the jobs there, please contact. And I think you can reach out via the Tech Open Air. And I think our time may be up. I want to thank everyone for for joining the panel, and it was great to talk to you, and really appreciate your coming, and all the best, and toi toi toi, as they say, for the election.
Absolutely. Biden might be winning Georgia. Woo!
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Thank you again.